Kate Covington had spent the better part of a year talking herself out of desperation, but on the morning she sealed the 13th envelope, her hands were shaking so badly that she nearly smeared the ink across the address altogether. The year was 1874, and Harrow's Bluff, Texas, was the kind of town that wore its loneliness like a second skin. It sat low and flat against the earth, surrounded by a scrubland that stretched in every direction until the horizon dissolved into a shimmer of heat. There were perhaps 200 souls living in Harrow's Bluff, and of those 200, fewer than 30 were women. And of those 30 women, Kate Covington was the only one who owned a deed to 40 acres of dry land and a half-built farmhouse, and not a single person to help her work it. She had come to Harrow's Bluff 3 years ago with her husband, Daniel Covington, who had been full of dreams the way young men from the East always were, convinced that the West was a place where a man could shape his own future with nothing but determination and a strong back. Daniel had been full of determination and a strong back, and he had also been full of a particularly bad luck that had seen him swept off a flooded crossing on the Brazos River in the spring of 1872, just 14 months after they had arrived. Kate had been 22 years old. She had buried an empty casket because they never recovered his body, and she had stood at that grave with a dry face because she had already cried herself hollow in the days before the service. She had stayed. That was the part that people in town still talked about, because a woman alone in that country in 1874 was not simply a curiosity, she was a small miracle. She had a sister back in Virginia who wrote every 3 months asking her to come home, and Kate wrote back every 3 months saying she was fine, which was a complicated word for what she actually was. She was surviving. She had a milk cow, 6 chickens, a kitchen garden that produced more than she could eat alone, and 40 acres that she could not properly farm without help. The neighbor to the west, old Hector Drummond, let her borrow his mule when she needed it, and the blacksmith in town, a quiet man named Avery Cole, had fixed her plow twice without charging her, which in Harrow's Bluff passed for great kindness. But kindness was not a partnership, and Kate was practical enough to know it. She had first heard about the matrimonial advertisements from Mrs. Prout, who ran the dry goods store and who had an opinion about everything, and delivered those opinions with the conviction of Scripture. Mrs. Prout had showed Kate an advertisement in a mail-order gazette from Denver, where a man in New Mexico was seeking a wife with domestic skills and a willing heart. Kate had laughed it off that first time because she was not yet ready to think of Daniel as someone she could move past. But the land did not care about her grief, and the land did not wait. By the following spring, she had written her first letter. She had composed it carefully at the little desk Daniel had built for her from pine boards, by the light of a single oil lamp, in the small bedroom of the farmhouse that still smelled faintly of sawdust from where the walls were not quite finished. She had written honestly, because she was not the kind of woman who knew how to be otherwise. She said she was 24 years old, that she was a widow, that she owned land in West Texas, that she was accustomed to hard work and had no romantic notions about the ease of frontier life, and that she was looking for a partner in the truest sense of the word. Not a savior, a partner. She had received no reply. She wrote again, to a different man whose advertisement she found in a different gazette. She described herself as tall and brown-haired and plain-spoken, because she was all 3 of those things. She said she made good bread and could shoot a rifle well enough to keep coyotes off the chickens. She said she laughed easily when there was something worth laughing about. She said she wanted children eventually, and a life built on something real. She received no reply. The 3rd letter she wrote to a man in Colorado, and the 4th to a rancher in the Panhandle, whose advertisement had mentioned that he admired a woman with practical sense, and the 5th to a cattle driver in New Mexico who said he was settling down. Letters 6, 7, and 8 went to men she had found through the notices posted in the Harrow's Bluff Mercantile, where word sometimes circulated about men seeking wives in surrounding counties. The ninth letter was the hardest to write, because by then she was beginning to understand that silence was its own kind of answer, and that answer was humiliating in a way she had not anticipated. She sat with that humiliation for 2 months before she wrote the 10th letter, and then the 11th, and then the 12th, which she sent to a man in San Antonio who had been specifically described by a mutual acquaintance as steady and good-natured, and looking for a wife with land. That letter came back unopened, stamped with a notice that the addressee had relocated and left no forwarding direction. Kate had set that returned envelope on her desk and looked at it for a long time. Outside, the wind was doing what it always did in West Texas, which was blow hard enough to make the walls of the farmhouse creak and send dust through every crack in the boards. The lamp flickered. The returned letter sat there looking as final as a door closing. She thought about her sister in Virginia. She thought about going back. She thought about what going back would mean, which was leaving the only thing she had left of the life she and Daniel had tried to build together. And she thought about what staying meant, which was more years of exactly this. The lamp and the dust and the creaking walls and the acreage going half to waste because she could not do the work of two people alone. She picked up her pen. She had found the name in a notice pinned to the board outside the post office in Harrow's Bluff, which was unusual because the notices there were usually for missing horses or upcoming town meetings. This one was a small, square piece of paper, written in a neat and deliberate hand that was neither boastful nor particularly polished, and it said simply that a man by the name of Cecil Rhodes, currently of Abilene, Kansas, was seeking correspondence with a woman of good character who was interested in settling in Texas, that he was 31 years old, a working cowboy with intentions to establish his own spread, and that he was a serious man who meant what he said. Kate had read that notice 3 times standing in the afternoon sun outside the post office, and something in the plainness of it had caught at her in a way the other advertisements had not. Most of the advertisements, whether in the gazettes or in the mercantile notices, had a quality of salesmanship to them, as though the men writing them were trying to convince a potential buyer rather than simply introduce themselves. This one had no such quality. It read like a man who had decided to say a thing honestly and then said it. She did not let herself hope. She had made that mistake too many times with the other letters, and had learned that hope was an expensive thing to carry around when the return on it kept coming back empty. She wrote the letter anyway. She wrote it in the same way she had written all the others, plainly and honestly, but this time she found herself adding something she had not put in any of the previous 12 letters. She wrote about the land itself. She described the way the sky over Harrow's Bluff looked at dusk, when it went through every color between gold and purple, before settling into a deep blue that seemed to go on forever, and how in winter the stars were so close and so bright that she sometimes stood outside in the cold just to look at them. She wrote that she loved the land even when it was difficult, that she had chosen to stay when she could have left, and that she was not looking for rescue, only for someone who might love the same difficult, beautiful country she had decided to call home. She sealed the envelope. She walked it to the post office herself rather than waiting for the next day's collection. She told herself as she walked back that she was not expecting anything. She told herself this so firmly and so repeatedly that she almost believed it. She waited 3 weeks. She was in the kitchen garden, on her knees in the dirt pulling weeds from around the tomato plants, when she heard the sound of a rider coming up the track from the main road. Visitors to her property were not common. Hector Drummond came by every couple of weeks to check on her in the neighborly way of men who had known hardship, and extended that knowledge into a general concern for others. But Hector rode a heavy old quarter horse named Beaumont, and this was not the sound of Beaumont's plodding walk. Kate sat back on her heels and pushed her hat up and looked toward the track. A horse was coming at a moderate trot, a solid bay with good conformation, carrying a rider who sat easy in the saddle the way only men who had spent years on horseback could sit, with a loose and natural balance that looked almost effortless. The rider pulled up at the gate of the kitchen garden, and Kate stood and pressed her hands against her skirt to clear them of dirt and looked up. He was somewhere in his early 30s, which matched what the notice had said. He had a face that had been thoroughly worked over by wind and sun, brown and weathered in the way that outdoor men's faces became in that country, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he squinted into the distance a great deal, which cowboys did. He was not what anyone would call handsome in the conventional way, but there was a quality of steadiness in his face that Kate noticed immediately, the way you noticed a well-built fence post or a reliable tool, not because it was beautiful but because it was clearly what it was supposed to be. He touched his hat brim. "Are you Miss Covington?" he said. His voice was a low, even tenor with a faint trace of somewhere further east in it, not Texas-born. "Mrs. Covington," Kate said, because she had never stopped using that name. "Though Kate is fine. Are you Mr. Rhodes?" "I am," he said. He climbed down from the horse in a single smooth motion and held the reins. He looked at her steadily, not in an appraising or uncomfortable way, but with a directness that matched his notice. "I got your letter. I wrote back, but I was not sure the letter would reach you before I did. I had business bringing a herd down from Kansas, and Harrow's Bluff was close enough on the route that it seemed better to come in person than to wait on the post." Kate looked at him for a moment. 3 weeks of telling herself she was not hoping anything had left her in a peculiar state, which was that she had almost convinced herself she did not care. And now the thing she had almost convinced herself she did not care about was standing at her garden gate on a bay horse looking as real and solid as the earth under her feet, and she found she did not know quite what to do with that. "You'd better come in and have some water," she said. "Your horse looks like he could use the trough." That was how it began, not with ceremony. Not with the kind of thing that people in novels described as a meeting of souls, but with water for a horse and a woman wiping dirt from her hands on her skirt, and a man who had ridden a long way and looked like he was prepared to say what he meant. She brought him a cup of water and one for herself, and they sat on the porch steps of the farmhouse, because the inside was, as she told him directly, in a state that she would rather not have company witness until she had warning enough to address it. He had laughed at that, a short, genuine laugh, and sat down on the steps without any apparent concern about the dust or the informality of it. They talked for 2 hours that afternoon. She learned that Cecil Rhodes had been born in Missouri in 1843, that he had come west after the war, in which he had served for the Union at some personal difficulty, since Missouri was a divided state, and his family had been divided along with it. He did not dwell on that, only mentioned it briefly as the explanation for why he had needed to go somewhere that was not where he had grown up. He had been working cattle for 9 years, first as a trail hand on the Kisham Trail, and then as a foreman for a ranch outside Abilene. He had saved money. He had specific ideas about the kind of land he wanted to work and the kind of operation he wanted to build. He was, Kate realized as he spoke, a man who had spent a great deal of time being deliberate, which was different from being cautious. Caution came from fear. Deliberateness came from knowing what you wanted. She told him about Daniel. She did not usually tell people about Daniel in the straightforward way she told Cecil, but there was something about his manner of listening, which was complete and quiet without being passive, that made honesty feel like the natural register of the conversation. She told him she was not over Daniel in the way that people used that phrase, as though grief were a mountain range that you crossed and left behind. She said she was over it in the way that you could be over something and still carry the mark of it, the way a healed bone was still the bone that had been broken. She said she wanted him to understand that she was not looking for anyone to replace Daniel, but that she was also not willing to be alone forever on the grounds that she had once been married to someone she loved. Cecil listened to all of this without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking out at the scrubland beyond the fence. "That seems honest," he said. "I try to be," she said. "So do I," he said, And then, after another pause, "The land is good." She had not expected him to say that. She had expected a response to the emotional weight of what she had shared, and instead he had turned his attention to the 40 acres around the farmhouse and rendered what was, coming from him, clearly a significant judgment. "You think so?" she said. "Not the richest soil I've ever seen," he said, "but it's workable, good well. Dug 12 feet down," she said. "Doesn't run dry even in August." He nodded slowly. "You've got the right pitch to the land for drainage. Needs fencing on the east side. The house wants 2 more rooms at least if you're planning on children." She stared at him. "You're getting somewhat ahead of the conversation, Mr. Rhodes." He looked at her then directly, and she saw that the lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper when he was trying to contain something that might have been amusement. "I meant as a general observation," he said, "about the potential of the property." "Of course you did," she said. He left before sundown, riding back toward town where he had taken a room at the boarding house Mrs. Pruitt's husband operated on the eastern edge of Main Street. He came back the next morning before she had finished her breakfast, because he had asked her permission to look at the fencing on the east side of the property, and she had given it, and because she discovered when she saw him coming up the track again that she had been expecting him, which was a thing she had not entirely admitted to herself the night before. He spent 3 days in Harrow's Bluff. He looked at the land. He fixed the east fence without being asked. He ate supper with her on the second evening, at the table inside the farmhouse, where the state of things was now presentable enough that she did not object, and they talked through the whole of the meal, and for 2 hours after it, about the land and the cattle market and the weather patterns in that part of Texas, and what she had planted in the kitchen garden, and what more could be planted, and about Missouri and Virginia, and the differences between East and West, and why some people who came to the frontier turned around and why others stayed. He told her about the herd he had brought down, 23 head that he had pooled his savings to buy and drive south, that were now in a holding pen outside town waiting for him to decide where to settle them. "You brought cattle before you had land," she said. "I had a notion of what I was looking for," he said. "Sometimes it's better to commit to a direction before you've found the exact destination. Otherwise, you wait forever." She thought about that for a moment, about 12 unanswered letters and 1/13 sent to a notice on a post office board, about standing over an empty casket in the Texas sun and deciding to stay, about commitment to direction without certainty of destination. "I understand that," she said. On the 3rd day, he sat down with her at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and said he had a proposal to make, and he wanted to make it clearly because he was not good at talking around things. He proposed a partnership, not immediately a marriage, because he was not the kind of man who thought a marriage proposal made on 3 days' acquaintance was the thing to do, but a working arrangement whereby he would bring his cattle onto her land, contribute his labor to the farm, and they would operate the spread jointly. He would sleep in town or build himself a temporary structure on the far corner of the property, whichever she considered appropriate, and they would spend the next several months determining whether they were as well suited in practice as they appeared to be in conversation. If at the end of that time they were, they would discuss the rest. Kate looked at him across the table. She thought about the 12 letters with no reply, and she thought about what those 12 silences had cost her in terms of dignity and hope. She thought about this man who had ridden down from Kansas because it was more reliable than the post, who had fixed her east fence without being asked, who spoke about her land with the same respect she felt for it herself. "I have some conditions," she said. "I would expect nothing less," he said. Her conditions were straightforward. He was to consult her on all decisions relating to the property, since it was her property, before taking action. He was to treat her as a partner in fact and not merely in name, which meant her opinions about the operation were equal to his own, not advisory. He was to be honest with her in all matters at all times, even matters he might think she would not wish to hear. And he was to understand that she was not a woman who would be managed, and that any attempt to manage her would be the end of the arrangement. He agreed to every condition without apparent hesitation. "You agreed very quickly," she said. "They're reasonable conditions," he said. "A man who wouldn't agree to those doesn't want a partner, he wants an employee who cooks. I don't want that." She looked at him steadily. "What do you want, Mr. Rhodes?" He met her eyes without looking away. "I want what I wrote in that notice," he said. "A real life, built on something real with someone who understands what that means." She was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light was coming through the window at a long angle, lying in a band across the table between them, and outside the wind was blowing in the particular way it did when the season was changing, carrying a faint edge of coolness that it had not had for months. "All right," she said, "we'll try it your way." Cecil Rhodes built himself a small structure in the far corner of the property in less than 2 weeks, using lumber he purchased in Harrow's Bluff and his own 2 hands, and it was small but solid, and he lived in it without complaint. He integrated the 23 head of cattle onto the land with a calm efficiency that impressed her, not because she had not believed he could do it, but because there was something quietly satisfying about watching a person do the thing they were genuinely good at. They worked together every day. This was not, as it turned out, a simple thing. Working with someone every day, in the physical and demanding way of farm and ranch work, had a way of revealing character with an immediacy that no amount of conversation could match. You learned very quickly whether a person was patient or short-tempered, careful or careless, willing to do the less pleasant work, or inclined to leave it for someone else. Kate watched Cecil Rhodes with the same practical attention she gave to everything on the property, because she was, at the core of her, a practical woman, and she was not willing to let the relief of having found someone answer her letter translate into an uncritical acceptance of who he was. What she found, over the course of those first weeks, was that he was patient. He was more patient than she was, which was somewhat surprising because she had always considered herself a patient person. He was patient with the cattle and patient with the stubborn soil and patient with the mule when it balked, and he was patient with her on the days when the accumulated weight of 3 years alone was still heavy enough to make her short and difficult. He never called attention to her short days. He just worked steadily through them, and by evening things were usually better. He was also honest in the precise way he had promised. One morning, in early October, he told her that he had noticed one of her chickens was showing signs of something he could not identify, but that she ought to watch. And 2 days later that chicken was dead, and the others needed to be kept separate until they were certain it had not spread. And the bluntness of his early warning was the kind of thing that cost her nothing compared to what a delay might have cost. She came to trust that quality in him, the willingness to say the thing that needed saying before it was comfortable to say it, because it was always accurate and always useful. She also, somewhere in those weeks, without precisely meaning to and without immediately identifying it for what it was, began to look forward to him. She began to look forward to the particular way he appeared at the door of the farmhouse in the morning, hat in hand, waiting to be invited in for coffee before they discussed the day's work, because he had never once in all the time they had been working together simply walked into her house uninvited, even though he was on her land every day and might easily have considered the boundary already crossed. She began to look forward to the evenings when he stayed to supper, which was becoming more often, and the way the conversation between them had the quality of something that had always existed and was simply being continued rather than constructed. She began to look forward to his laugh, which was infrequent enough to feel significant when it appeared. She did not, for several more weeks, do anything with these observations. It was Mrs. Prout, characteristically, who forced the issue, or at least attempted to. Mrs. Prout came to call in early November, which was unusual enough in itself, and sat in Kate's kitchen with a cup of coffee and a plate of shortbread she had brought and delivered the opinion that it was the talk of Harrow's Bluff that Kate Covington had a man living on her property, and that while people did not necessarily mean ill by their talk, it would be better for her reputation if the situation were clarified. Kate looked at Mrs. Prout with the particular expression she reserved for conversations that required her to be polite while disagreeing. "The situation is clarified," she said. "Mr. Rhodes is my business partner. He lives in a separate structure on the far end of the property. The arrangement is entirely appropriate." "People talk," Mrs. Prout said. "People have always talked," Kate said. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Prout, but my reputation and my land are both in order, and I am not going to make decisions about either based on what people say over fences." Mrs. Prout left looking somewhat unsatisfied. Kate went back to her work. That evening, when Cecil stayed for supper, she told him about the visit. She told him because they had agreed to be honest with each other about all matters, and this was a matter that affected them both, and she wanted to hear what he thought. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. He was turning his coffee cup in his hands, a habit she had noticed he had when he was thinking through something carefully. "Does it bother you?" he said. "The talk." "Not the talk itself," she said. "I care about my reputation only in the practical sense, which is that a woman alone in this country depends more on community goodwill than a man does, so I can't entirely ignore it. But I'm not going to alter what I know is correct because someone else is uncomfortable with it." He nodded. He was quiet for another moment. "Is there something you think ought to be altered?" She looked at him. "Are you asking me something directly, Mr. Rhodes, or are you asking me something indirectly?" He set down his coffee cup and looked at her with the directness she had come to rely on. "I'm asking whether you have an opinion about the direction of what we're doing," he said. "Because I have one, and I have been trying to be patient about timing, and I am finding that patience increasingly difficult." Kate felt something shift in her chest, something that had been held in a careful suspension for weeks, and the sensation was strange because it was not entirely pleasant. It was the feeling of something you have been very carefully not allowing yourself to feel starting to become unavoidable. "Tell me your opinion," she said. "I think you are remarkable," he said, simply and without decoration. "I think what you have done here, staying on this land, working it, keeping it, doing it alone for 3 years, is one of the most genuinely impressive things I have ever seen a person do. I think you are the most honest person I have ever met, and I think your honesty is not a convenient quality, it is a fundamental one. I think the land suits you and you suit the land. And I think that what I came down from Kansas looking for, I found it on the 3rd day, and I have been trying not to say so until you were ready to hear it." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind had died down for once, and there was a stillness that the Texas nights sometimes had in November when the cold had not yet come in hard but the warmth was gone. "Cecil," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without thinking about it first. "Kate," he said. "I'm not entirely sure I know how to do this," she said. "I did it once and then I didn't have it anymore, and the not having it was the worst thing I have ever survived. I'm not saying that to warn you away. I'm saying it because you asked for honesty and that's the honest thing." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be unafraid. I'm asking you to let me try." She looked at him for a long time across the kitchen table, across the lamplight and the coffee cups and the remains of supper, and she thought about 12 unanswered letters and what they had cost her, and what the 13th reply had brought to her gate on a bay horse one September afternoon. "All right," she said, which was what she said when she meant something completely and without reservation. He did not try to hold her hand that night or say anything further about it. He finished his coffee and thanked her for supper and walked back across the dark property to his small structure, and she sat at the table for a while after he was gone, listening to the quiet, and found that the quiet felt different than it had before. Not empty, something more like expectant. Winter in West Texas in 1874 was not the brutal thing that winter was in Kansas or Colorado, but it had its own character. The cold was dry and came in fast on the north wind, and the temperature at night could drop sharply enough to be dangerous for both cattle and people who were not prepared. Cecil and Kate worked through November and into December with the shared purpose of getting the land and the animals properly sheltered before the worst of it came. There was more work than there was daylight, and the days were long and physical, and exhausted her in the particular good way of honest labor. And every evening they sat together at the kitchen table and ate and talked, and gradually, without ceremony, the situation between them clarified itself in the way that situations between two people who are paying honest attention to each other tend to do. He held her hand for the first time in December, on a cold morning when they were checking the cattle, and she had slipped on a patch of frost-hard ground and he had caught her. And when she had her footing back, he had simply not let go of her hand, and she had simply not pulled it away, and they had walked back across the field like that without speaking about it, because there was nothing to speak about. He kissed her at Christmas, standing on the porch of the farmhouse where she had hung a wreath made of dried prairie grasses, because it was the only available material, when they had been looking at the stars for a long time in the cold, and the sky had been doing exactly what she had described in her letter. Every shade of deep blue with the stars so close they seemed solid. He had turned to look at her in the middle of something she had been saying about the stars, and the expression on his face had made her stop talking, and he had said, "May I?" And she had said yes, and that was that. The people of Harrow's Bluff talked about the wedding in February of 1875 for months afterward, not because it was elaborate, because it was not, but because of the unlikely quality of the story attached to it. Mrs. Prout, in the particular way of people who enjoy being right even when they are right in a direction they had not initially intended, said she had always thought it would work out well. Hector Drummond, who attended the ceremony and shook Cecil's hand afterward with the solemnity of a man conducting important business, said it was the best thing that had happened to that property since the Covingtons had arrived, which was the highest compliment he could have offered. Avery Cole, the blacksmith, said nothing because he was not a man of many words, but he shook both their hands and his face said clearly that he was glad. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, who came through Harrow's Bluff every 6 weeks, a lean and cheerful man named Reverend Ashworth, who had conducted a great many frontier weddings, and had the practical minister's approach to all of them, which was to make sure the essential things were said, and not to labor the ceremony to a length that tired the participants before the reception. Kate wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that had been her good dress since Virginia and still fit her, and she carried a small bunch of dried winter wildflowers that Cecil had found somewhere and presented to her that morning without saying where he had found them, which she found endearing in a way she could not entirely articulate. She stood in front of the small congregation of Harrow's Bluff's residents in the little white church and said the words with a steady voice and dry eyes, not because she was not feeling the weight of them, but because what she was feeling was not grief or fear. It was the particular gravity of a moment that was exactly what it was supposed to be. Cecil said his words in the same even tenor she had heard the first afternoon on her porch steps, and when Reverend Ashworth said he could kiss the bride and he did, it was not showy or dramatic. It was just the natural continuation of December on the porch steps, clear and certain, and exactly enough. There was a small gathering at the church afterward, with food brought by the women of the town in the way of frontier communities, where a shared table was the expression of goodwill. And Kate ate and talked and laughed, and accepted the congratulations of her neighbors, and found that she was happy in a way that did not diminish what she had felt with Daniel, and did not pretend that the intervening years had not happened, but simply stood alongside all of it as its own true thing. Cecil called the property the Covington Road Spread, and when she raised an eyebrow at the order of the names, he said that she had been there first and the land knew her name, so hers ought to go first. She said that was either very sensible or very diplomatic, and she wasn't entirely sure which. He said it was both, and she could take it however she liked. The spring of 1875 was the kind of spring that rewarded people who had made good preparations. The kitchen garden expanded significantly with Cecil's labor added to hers, and the cattle were doing well on the west pasture, and Cecil had gotten a small line of credit at the bank in the county seat to purchase 12 more head, which brought their total to 35, enough to begin thinking seriously about a proper operation rather than just a modest holding. They disagreed sometimes. Not frequently, and not in ways that lasted, but genuinely, because they were both people who had strong opinions rooted in experience and were not inclined to pretend otherwise. They disagreed about the timing of the spring planting, and about whether to take a particular offer from a buyer in Abilene, and about what to do when the well started showing signs of silt, and Cecil thought they should dig it deeper, and Kate thought they should look at drilling a new one to the south where the ground felt different. Kate turned out to be right about the well. Cecil turned out to be right about the Abilene buyer, who came back 3 weeks later with a better offer when the first was declined. After the well disagreement, Cecil had said, with the equanimity of a man who was not wounded by being wrong, "You know this land better than I do. You know cattle better than I do," she had said. "Then we're doing this correctly," he had said. In June of 1875, Kate told Cecil she was going to have a child, and she told him on the porch in the evening in the careful way she had of delivering significant information, directly and without preamble, because she had learned that approach from him. He had been very still for a moment, and then he had looked at her with an expression she had only seen a handful of times on his weathered face, unguarded and without the composed steadiness that was his habitual presentation, and he had said, "Kate," in a voice that was rough in a way it usually wasn't, and she had said, "Yes," and he had taken both her hands and held them for a long time without saying anything else, which said everything. He worried about her in the way that men in that era worried about their wives in pregnancy, which meant with a practical attentiveness that occasionally crossed the line into wanting to prevent her from doing things she was entirely capable of doing. She drew a firm line at being treated as an invalid. They had one significant argument about it in August, when he tried to tell her that she should not be hauling water from the well in the 3rd stage of her pregnancy, and she had told him that she had been hauling water her entire life and intended to continue, and he had said something about common sense that had the edge of presumption in it, and she had set down the bucket and looked at him with the expression that he had by then learned meant he had overstepped. "I am not a fragile thing," she said. "I know you're not," he said. "That is not the point." "Then what is the point?" He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through something. "The point," he said, "is that I am aware every day that things can go wrong, that this country takes people. I know you stayed when it took Daniel. I'm asking you, not telling you, to let me be useful in ways that reduce the risk of anything happening to you or the child, because I do not know what I would do if something happened to you." That was as much as he had ever said directly about what she meant to him in those particular terms, and it landed differently than an order or a presumption, because it was neither. It was an admission. She let him haul the water. Their son was born in October of 1875, delivered by the doctor who came out from the county seat, a methodical man named Dr. Harker, who had delivered a great many frontier babies, and whose calm competence was the most reassuring thing Kate had ever experienced in what was a difficult and exhausting day. Cecil spent most of that day outside the house doing things with his hands, checking the cattle and the fences and the store of winter feed, because he needed to be in motion when he was afraid, and he was afraid. Dr. Harker had told him to stay calm and make himself useful elsewhere, and he had done so with the rigid control of a man, using every resource he had to comply with an instruction he did not want to follow. When Dr. Harker appeared at the door and told him he had a son and his wife was well, Cecil Rhodes sat down on the porch steps where he and Kate had first talked and put his face in his hands for a moment in a way that was not crying but was near it, and Dr. Harker, who had seen this many times, gave him a moment and then said, "You can go in now." He went in. Kate was in the bed with the baby, pale and tired in the particular way of a woman who has done the hardest work available to a person and is now resting at the other side of it. The baby was small and red and deeply unimpressed with the world, making a sound somewhere between protest and astonishment. Cecil sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son, and Kate looked at him. "He looks like he has opinions," she said. "Where would he have gotten that from?" Cecil said. She laughed, which was the first laugh she had managed in the full day of labor, and it was brief and tired and real. They named the boy Thomas Daniel Rhodes, Thomas for Cecil's father, Daniel for Kate's first husband, because Kate said that Daniel's name belonged in the continuation of the life he had helped her begin here, and Cecil agreed without hesitation, which she had not entirely expected and was deeply grateful for. Thomas Daniel Rhodes was a solid and loudly opinionated baby who grew into a solid and loudly opinionated small boy with Kate's directness and Cecil's patience, and an apparently independent collection of characteristics that belonged to neither of them, including a fascination with snakes that Kate found alarming and Cecil found instructive. Cecil taught the boy everything he knew about cattle and horses with the same methodical care he brought to everything, and Kate taught him to read at the kitchen table by lamplight the same way she had been taught, and Harrow's Bluff got used to seeing the Rhodes boy riding behind his father across the south pasture on a horse that was still technically too big for him, but that he managed with a confidence that suggested he did not know this. The Covington road spread grew. It grew steadily and without drama, in the way of operations run by people who are more interested in the long arc of a thing than in quick gains. By 1878, they had 100 head of cattle and had hired a hand named Paco Reyes, a Mexican cowboy in his early 20s who had grown up working cattle in the south of Texas, and who knew the country and the animals in a way that was immediately evident and useful. Paco was quiet and competent and took his work seriously, and he fit into the rhythm of the spread in a way that felt natural, and Kate paid him a fair wage and treated him with the same directness she treated everyone, which he appeared to appreciate in a country and time where that was not always the experience of Mexican workers. Kate was aware of the injustices of that time and place, the way certain people were looked at and treated differently, the way the law did not always extend its protections equally. She had lived long enough in Harrow's Bluff to have seen it clearly, in the way that Paco was sometimes treated in town, and in the way that certain conversations stopped when he walked into certain establishments. She said something about it when it happened and could be addressed, and she said it with the directness that was her nature, and it was not always received well, and she did not stop saying it anyway. Cecil, who had been on the frontier long enough to have seen every variety of how people treated each other in a place where law was thin and custom was thick, shared her opinion. He said less about it in public, because he was not a man who said things publicly that could be said more usefully directly, and so what he did was treat Paco with the uncomplicated equality of a man who judged his workers by their work, and in the long way of things that mattered more than speeches. In the spring of 1878, Kate discovered she was pregnant again. She told Cecil in the same direct way she had the first time on the porch in the evening, and his reaction was the same unguarded expression that she had learned to recognize as the one he kept back for moments that were too large for his habitual composure. "Happy," she said. "Extremely," he said. He reached over and took her hand. "Are you?" She looked out at the spread, at the south pasture where the cattle were visible in the last of the evening light, at the kitchen garden that had expanded again this year with a second row of beds, at the farmhouse that now had the 2 additional rooms Cecil had noted the need for on his very first day, at the small building in the far corner of the property that was now used for storage and had been there long enough that it was faintly sentimental. "Yes," she said. "Extremely." Their daughter was born in the fall of 1878. They named her Clara May Rhodes, and she was, from her first weeks, an entirely different creature from Thomas, quieter and more observant, with wide, dark eyes that tracked everything in a room with an attention that made adults self-conscious, as though they were being evaluated. She was Cecil's in the particular way that was not about preference but about recognition, the way sometimes a child and a parent share a quality of character so fundamental that you can see it plainly from the outside. Clara had his steadiness. She could sit in a room full of noise and be entirely undisturbed by it, because she was attending to what interested her, and the rest was simply not relevant. Kate loved watching Cecil with Clara. She loved watching the way this man, who was naturally reserved and not given to excessive demonstration of feeling, would sit for long stretches with the baby in his arms with a quality of peace on his face that was entirely different from his working face or his thinking face or even his happy face. It was the face of a man who had found something he had not known he was looking for and was now engaged in the serious business of being grateful for it. The town of Harrow's Bluff changed around them over those years, as frontier towns did, sometimes growing and sometimes not, subject to the same forces that shaped everything in that country: the cattle market, the railway, the weather, the decisions made by men in distant cities who never saw the land they were deciding about. A spur of the railroad reached a town 15 miles to the east in 1877, and this changed everything about how cattle were moved and sold, and Cecil had anticipated it correctly and positioned the spread to benefit from it, which Kate observed and did not say she was impressed but was. There were hard years. 1879 brought a drought that tested everything they had built, the driest summer since Kate had been in Texas, the kind of summer where the sky was white with heat, and the grass turned to straw, and the cattle needed to be managed with a careful attention to water and movement, or you would lose them. They did not lose any cattle, because Cecil was very good at what he did and Paco was invaluable. But the kitchen garden came close to failure, and the tension of the drought was a presence in the house for months, a low background stress that both of them carried without speaking about it much, because speaking about it used energy that was needed elsewhere. On a night in August of that year, in the middle of the drought, when Kate could not sleep because of the heat and had gone out to sit on the porch steps and look at the stars, Cecil had come out after her and sat beside her without saying anything, and they had sat together in the dark for a long time with the hot, dry wind moving across the land. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Not about anything specific, just the general question." "Sometimes," he said. "Less than I used to be." "Why less?" "Because before I had something worth protecting," he said. "Fear without stakes is just unease. This is different. This is because something matters." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The stars were doing what they always did, brilliant and indifferent and beautiful. "We'll be all right," she said, which was the first time she had said that to him rather than to herself. "Yes," he said, "we will." The drought broke in September. Not dramatically, not with the kind of storm that old-timers told stories about, but with a steady, quiet rain that came in on a cool front from the northwest and lasted 2 days, soaking into the cracked earth with a gradual gentleness that felt almost careful, as though the sky understood that what it was rehydrating had been patient and deserved to be treated gently in return. Kate stood on the porch in the rain and let it fall on her hair and her face and her hands, and did not go inside. After a moment, Cecil came and stood beside her, and then Thomas appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt, looking uncertain about whether this was a situation he was invited to participate in, and Kate said, "Come on then." And Thomas came out and stood in the rain with his parents, and Clara was brought out too, wrapped in her blanket and held against Cecil's chest, her dark eyes wide at the sensation of rain, which she had not experienced in any memorable way before. "This is rain," Cecil told his daughter in the low voice he used with her, factual and gentle. "That's right," Kate said to Clara. "Remember this." Harrow's Bluff continued, and the Covington road spread continued with it. The years made their marks in the ordinary and extraordinary ways of years, the children growing, the herd expanding, the land rewarding the attention paid to it. Thomas at 4 was throwing a rope with an accuracy that amazed people who saw it. Clara at 3 was, as Kate described her to her sister in a letter to Virginia, reading words off the labels of the dry goods tins, and the letter had brought an amused response from the sister and an invitation to come east and visit. And they had not gone yet, but the letter had come back with the warmth of maintained connection across a significant distance. In 1880, Hector Drummond, the old neighbor to the west who had lent Kate his mule and his general concern for 3 years before Cecil arrived, died quietly in his sleep in the winter, which was the kind of death that people in Harrow's Bluff called a good one, meaning the man had not suffered. Kate went to the small service that was held for him and said goodbye to the old man, who had been a piece of the human landscape of her most alone years, and felt the loss as a specific and real thing, even as she was grateful for how different those years were now. She talked to Cecil about Hector that evening. She told him what Hector had meant in those early years, the mule and the unspoken concern that she was not invisible, and Cecil had listened in the complete and quiet way he had, and when she finished he had said, "He sounds like a man who understood what it meant to be a good neighbor." "He did," she said. "I hope we are the same." "We try to be," he said. They were. They were the kind of people that a community like Harrow's Bluff generated stories about, not because they were dramatic or spectacular, but because they were reliable. When a family came through in the fall of 1880 whose wagon had broken an axle 20 miles east and who were trying to make it to a cousin's property before winter, they stayed on the Covington road spread for 2 weeks while Cecil repaired the wagon and helped the family understand the route, and Paco showed the father the best way to handle the terrain to the west. When Mrs. Pruitt's husband fell ill in the spring of 1881, and the dry goods store was in danger of closing for lack of someone to run it, Kate went in 3 days a week for 2 months until he recovered, adding this to her existing work with the calm practicality of a woman who did what needed doing. The correspondence with her sister in Virginia, Martha, who had married a schoolteacher and had 3 children and a house with a proper garden, became something that gave Kate genuine pleasure in a way it had not always done. When she had first come west, the letters from Martha had carried a quality of alternate life, reminders of what Kate might have had if she had stayed, which were not entirely comfortable to read. Now they were simply the letters of 2 sisters living different lives with genuine curiosity and affection for each other. Martha had asked once whether Kate was truly happy out there, and Kate had written back a long letter that described the land and the sky and the kitchen garden and the cattle and Thomas's rope and Clara's reading and Cecil sitting on the porch steps the way she had first seen him, easy and direct and entirely himself, and had said yes. She was truly happy, not in the way of people who had gotten everything they expected, but in the way of people who had gotten something realer and more durable than expectation. There was a morning in the spring of 1881, 6 years after the wedding in the white church in Harrow's Bluff, when Kate woke early and lay in the gray light before dawn and listened to the sounds of the spread waking up, the cattle moving in the south pasture, the birds beginning in the sparse trees near the well, the sound of Cecil's breathing beside her in the way that had become as familiar as the sound of the wind or the creak of the house. Thomas was old enough now to sleep through things. Clara still sometimes woke early and would appear at the door of the bedroom with her blanket and her evaluating dark eyes, and simply stand there until someone acknowledged her, which Cecil invariably did first because he was always partially awake before dawn, a habit of years on the trail that had never fully left him. Kate lay in that gray morning and thought, with the clarity that comes in the quiet of very early light, about the sequence of things. She thought about Daniel, and the way that grief had transformed over the years from a sharp and constant presence into something that lived in her like the memory of weather, real but not current, part of the landscape of who she was without being the landscape itself. She thought about the 12 letters that had gone out into the world and come back as silence. She thought about the 13th notice on the post office board, the small square of paper in a neat and deliberate hand, and the woman she had been when she read it, standing in the afternoon sun with 3 years of aloneness behind her and nothing certain ahead. She thought about what it had taken to write that 13th letter. Not courage exactly, though courage was part of it. Something more like the particular stubbornness of a person who has decided that giving up would be a misrepresentation of themselves, the refusal to let 12 silences be the definition of her story. And she thought about what had come back from that letter. A man on a bay horse at her garden gate. A fence fixed without being asked. 2 hours of conversation on a September afternoon that had felt like continuing something rather than beginning it. A winter of working partnership and growing honesty, and one evening on the porch with stars and permission asked and freely given. A wedding in February with dried wildflowers and a blue dress. A son named partly for the man who had come before, because both men were part of who she was, and the present did not require the erasure of the past. A daughter with her father's steadiness. A spread that was both of theirs in every way that mattered. A life that was, in every sense she had meant when she wrote about it in that 13th letter, built on something real. Cecil stirred beside her, and she turned to look at him in the gray light. He was awake. He was often awake at this hour, lying still and looking at the ceiling with the thinking look he had. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said. He turned his head to look at her. Even in the gray light she could read his face easily now, the way you could read familiar terrain. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything," she said. "The letters, the beginning of things, how different it might have been." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you regret any of it?" She considered this seriously, the way he always asked her to consider serious things. "No," she said. "Not any of it, even the hard years, even the 12 silences, because the direction of all of it was here." He reached over and took her hand, which was what he did when words were not the right tool for what he meant. She turned her hand to hold his. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I'm going to have another child." He was still for a moment. Then he turned and looked at her with that unguarded expression, the one that was her favorite thing on his weathered face. "Kate," he said. "I know," she said. "We are going to be very busy." He laughed. The short, genuine laugh that she had first heard on the porch steps on a September afternoon in 1874, and it was exactly the same laugh now as it had been then, unchanged by the years and the work and the children and the drought and the cattle and the growth of the spread, unchanged by the weight of everything that had been built between that September and this spring morning, the same laugh that was infrequent enough to mean something every time she heard it. The third child was another boy, born in December of 1881, and they named him William Cecil Rhodes, William for Kate's grandfather who had been a man she admired, Cecil for his father, because Kate said a name passed to a child was not vanity but continuity, and she wanted the chain to hold. William Cecil was a wild and energetic creature from the moment of his birth, bearing no resemblance in temperament to his careful sister or his focused brother, a child who came into every room with a kind of kinetic enthusiasm that was exhausting and delightful in equal measure. Paco Reyes, who had been with the spread long enough to have watched Thomas learn to ride and Clara learn to read, took one look at young William at 6 months old throwing his rattle across the room with evident satisfaction, and said to Cecil that this one was going to keep them young, and Cecil had said he rather thought that was the plan. Paco himself had settled. He had met a woman in the town to the east, Elena, who worked at the hotel and who was, as Paco described her with a simplicity that mirrored the notice Cecil had once written for a post office board, exactly what he had been looking for. They had married in 1880, and Elena came to the spread sometimes on Sundays and helped with things in a spirit of friendliness that Kate welcomed genuinely. And the two women had developed the kind of direct and practical friendship that women in frontier communities develop with each other, rooted in shared understanding of what daily life in that country required. The spread was, by 1882, a proper ranch. Not the largest in the county, not anything that would make the Texas papers as a notable operation, but solid and well-managed and respected among the people who dealt with it, the buyers and the neighboring ranchers and the bank and the merchants in town. Cecil had built the name of the operation on the same principles he applied to everything, on honesty and steady work, and the willingness to take the long view on decisions that tempted shorter thinking. And the land had responded to that approach in the way that land responds to being understood. Kate, who had planted the kitchen garden in the first year of her widowhood and expanded it every year since, now had something that was closer to a serious kitchen enterprise than a subsistence garden. She had been selling produce to the hotel in the town to the east for 2 years, and to the boarding house in Harrow's Bluff, and had developed a strain of tomato through careful seed selection over several seasons that was more drought-resistant than the varieties available from the seed catalogs. And she was aware that this was something of practical value, without having any particular sense of what to do with that knowledge other than share it with the women in town who asked her about it. One afternoon in the summer of 1882, sitting at the kitchen table with the 3 children in various states of occupation around her, Clara reading and Thomas cleaning a piece of tack and William, apparently trying to see how many small objects he could fit into his pockets, Kate wrote a long letter to her sister Martha and tried to describe what a day on the spread was actually like. From the dawn that Cecil always noticed before she did to the evening when the children were settled and they sat on the porch and the stars came out. She tried to describe the smell of the land after rain and the sound of the cattle at dusk, and the way the kitchen felt on winter mornings when the stove was hot and the light was coming in low and gold through the east window. She wrote that she had once thought she knew what she wanted and then had it taken from her, and had then spent years not knowing whether wanting was still available to her as an option, not because she was broken, but because the wanting had become associated with something that could also be lost, and that made it a dangerous thing. She wrote that what had gotten her to the 13th letter was not bravery but stubbornness, which was a quality she had always had, and which the years alone had sharpened to a fine edge. And she wrote that what the 13th letter had brought her was not what she had asked for in any of the other 12, which was practical partnership and company and help with the land, but something she had not thought to ask for because she had not known it was still possible, which was a life that felt entirely and completely like her own, chosen and built and daily renewed. She sealed that letter and gave it to Thomas to take to the post office on his way to town, which he did with the reliable competence of a 6-year-old who had grown up being trusted with genuine responsibilities and took them seriously. The post office in Harrow's Bluff still had a board outside it, and on that board there were still notices about town meetings and lost horses, and occasionally an advertisement from someone seeking correspondence. Kate walked past that board every time she went into town, and she always looked at it, not with any sense of longing or any reminder of the hard years, but with the quiet attention of a woman who knew what a small piece of paper nailed to a board could do, what it could set in motion, what one particular notice in a neat and deliberate hand had done for her. She said this to Cecil once, that she always looked at the board. He had been surprised not that she looked, but that she had not mentioned it before. "What do you think about when you look at it?" he said. "I think about the distance between 14 months ago and now," she said. Which was their way of talking about the vast arc of what had happened, because 14 months was what she meant. The 14 months between September of 1874, when he had ridden up to her garden gate, and February of 1875, when they had stood in the white church. But the phrase had expanded over the years to encompass everything. All the distance between the woman who had sealed the 13th envelope with shaking hands and the woman who was standing beside him on Main Street in the summer of 1882 with 3 children and a ranch and a life that was in every way what it was supposed to be. "That's a lot of distance," he said. "It is," she said. He took her hand on Main Street in Harrow's Bluff in the plain sight of anyone who happened to look, which was not a particularly dramatic gesture in itself, but was the kind of uncomplicated public claim that she had come to understand as his particular language for things that were important to him. The town around them did its daily business, and the wind blew in the way it always did, and the sky was the immense blue of a Texas summer, and the board outside the post office held its various notices. By the fall of 1882, Thomas was 7 and learning to shoot properly under Cecil's careful instruction, and Clara was 4 and had worked through every book Kate owned, and was now writing her own small texts on the back pages of the account ledgers in a round and determined hand. William, approaching his first birthday, was managing a staggering wobble that suggested walking was imminent, and that the household should probably secure all breakable items at an elevated height. It was in that fall that Cecil made an announcement over supper one evening that he had spoken to a lawyer in the county seat about formally putting Kate's name on the cattle operation alongside the property deed, so that what they had built together was legally constituted as belonging to both of them in a way that was clear and documented. This was not, in 1882, a standard thing. Property law in Texas did not make it simple for women to hold title alongside their husbands, and the lawyer had been somewhat bewildered by the request, but Cecil had been characteristically patient and clear about what he wanted and why, and the documentation had been arranged. Kate had not been expecting this. She sat at the table after he told her and was quiet for a moment in a way that was rare for her. "You did that without telling me," she said. "I wanted to have it done before I told you," he said. "So it was not a conversation about whether but about what had happened." She looked at him. "That is either very considerate or a technique for avoiding the negotiation of whether I wanted you to do it." "Both," he said. "Did it occur to you that I might have wanted to be part of that conversation?" He was quiet for a moment. "It did occur to me," he said. "I decided that in this case what you would have wanted was the outcome, and the most efficient path to the outcome did not require the conversation. I may have been wrong about that." She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about all serious things. "You were not wrong about the outcome," she said. "You may have been slightly wrong about the path, but I think your intentions were exactly right." "My intentions," he said, "were that what we have built belongs to both of us and the law ought to reflect what is actually true." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said. They sat at the table for a while after the children were in bed that evening, in the way they had been sitting at kitchen tables together for years, in the lamplight with coffee cups, and the conversation moved from the legal matter to the cattle to the plans for the following year, to Clara's reading to what they were going to do about the broken north fence, to what the winter was likely to bring. It was an ordinary conversation. It was a conversation about nothing more significant than the daily business of a ranch and a family in West Texas, in the fall of 1882. And it was exactly what Kate had been looking for when she sealed the 13th envelope with shaking hands on a morning when the wind was blowing and the lamp was flickering, and 12 silences were stacked behind her and the land was going half to waste, and she had decided, out of stubbornness or hope or the refusal to let silence be the definition of her story, to try one more time. This was what she had been looking for. Not rescue, not a solution to loneliness. Not a man to do the things she could not do herself, because by then she was doing most of them herself. A partner in the truest sense of the word. Someone who understood what she meant when she said built on something real, because he already knew, without needing it explained, that built on something real was the only way worth building. William said his first word the following week. It was not mama or daddy or any of the words that parents expected and waited for. It was a word that caused Cecil to immediately look at Kate with an expression that contained both pride and resignation. His first word was no, delivered with a conviction that suggested he had been practicing it internally for months and was pleased to finally have the vocal capacity to deploy it. "He's yours," Cecil said. "He absolutely is not," Kate said, but she was laughing. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was a good one, which in Texas meant cold but not brutal, with enough moisture to keep the land from going desperately dry and enough clear days to keep the work moving. They added 2 more cattle pens in the East Field, and Cecil had a long and complicated conversation with the railway agent in the next town about rates, which he eventually resolved to his satisfaction in the way he resolved most things, by being patient and clear and willing to wait out the other party. Paco brought Alina to supper on Christmas of 1882, and Alina brought a dish of something that smelled of chilies and richness that William immediately attempted to reach from his chair. And the evening was loud with children and conversation, and the particular warmth of a table with enough food, and enough people who genuinely wanted to be there. Kate looked around that table on Christmas evening with the lamplight on all the faces, Cecil and Thomas and Clara and William and Paco and Alina, and she thought about the kitchen table in December of 1874 with the one oil lamp and the returned letter and the creak of the walls and the wind outside. She thought about the distance between that table and this one. It was, she thought, an enormous distance. It was also, in another sense, a perfectly continuous line, because the woman who had sat at that table in 1874 and picked up her pen was the same woman who was sitting at this table in 1882, unchanged in the things that mattered, in the stubbornness and the honesty and the love of the land and the willingness to try one more time. The life at this table was the product of that woman's refusal to let silence be the final word. She caught Cecil's eye across the table, over the heads of the children and through the noise of the conversation, and he was looking at her with the steady and knowing look that she had learned over 8 years was his particular way of being present with her across a distance, a look that said, "I see you, and I know what you are thinking, and what you are thinking is true." She smiled at him. He smiled back, which was a smaller and more contained smile than other people's smiles, but was, she had long since determined, among the most genuine things she had ever seen. Thomas grew into a young man with a rope and a horse, and a talent for the land that pleased Cecil profoundly and quietly. Clara grew into a girl who read everything she could get her hands on and had begun, by the time she was 7, to write letters on behalf of neighbors who could not write themselves, which was a service she offered without being asked and delivered without condescension. William remained a force of kinetic energy that the household accommodated with a resigned and affectionate pragmatism. The spread grew. The years passed. In the spring of 1885, Kate wrote to her sister Martha that Harrow's Bluff had changed, not dramatically, but in the accumulating way of places that are shaped by time and weather and the people who live in them. There was a proper school now, built by community effort over 2 years, where Clara went with an urgency that made the mornings a dedicated argument about whether there was time for breakfast first. Thomas was 12 and already thinking about the cattle operation, with the particular focus of a boy who knows what he is going to do with his life and is making himself ready for it. William was 3 and had added to know a collection of opinions delivered with tremendous authority and limited vocabulary. Kate wrote to Martha that she was, in a word she had rarely used for herself in the years immediately after Daniel, content. Not the passive contentment of someone who has stopped wanting things, but the active contentment of someone who has built what she wanted and lives in it daily, and finds it solid and real and worth the building. She wrote that she thought about the 12 letters sometimes, and she thought about what those 12 silences had meant and whether they had been failures. She had decided they had not been failures. They had been necessary. Not in any providential sense, not in the sense that she believed the universe had arranged things to lead her to a specific outcome, but in the practical sense that they had taught her exactly how to write the 13th letter, what to put in it that she had not put in any of the others. The story of the land, the stars, the love of the difficult, beautiful country, the honesty about what she wanted and what she was not looking for. The 13th letter had been the 13th letter not despite the 12 silences, but because of them. She sealed that letter to Martha and set it with the others to go to town. Cecil came in from the south pasture in the late afternoon with dust on his hat and the particular look of a man who has had a productive day. And Thomas came in behind him with the same dust and a slightly more triumphant version of the same look. And they sat at the table and drank water, and Kate put supper on, and they talked about the cattle and the fence and the plan for the following week. And Clara came in from the school direction with a book under her arm that did not belong to the school, and that she had clearly borrowed from somewhere without specifying where. And William appeared from the back garden, where he had been engaged in some project involving mud that he was not offering to explain. Kate stood at the stove and listened to the noise of all of it, the voices and the chairs and the particular living quality of a house with people in it who were glad to be there. And she thought about the letter she had just sealed, about the things she had written to Martha about contentment and the 12 silences and the 13th letter. And she thought that all of those words were true, but none of them quite captured the specific texture of this moment. The supper smell and the voices and the lamplight just beginning to be necessary as the afternoon faded, and Cecil's hand on her shoulder as he passed behind her on the way to hang up his hat. "Good day," he said. "Good day," she said. It was such a simple thing to say. It was the simplest possible thing, the kind of thing exchanged between people every day in houses all over the world, but coming from him and answered by her in this kitchen on this spread in Harrow's Bluff, Texas, in the spring of 1885. It contained within it the whole of what they had made together. The 40 acres and the 140 cattle and the 3 children, and the years of honest work and the kitchen table conversations, and the December porch and the February wedding, and the September afternoon on which a man had ridden up to a garden gate on a bay horse and said, "Are you Miss Covington?" She was not Miss Covington. She was Kate Covington Rhodes, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be, and everything that had led her here had been, in the end, worth every letter and every silence and every shaking hand. The supper was ready. She called the children to the table. They came in the noisy and characteristic way of children who are hungry and have things to say about their day, and Cecil sat at the end of the table, and Thomas sat beside him, and Clara took the chair she always took, and William was lifted into his, and immediately had opinions about what was on his plate. The lamplight fell across the table and across all of them. Outside, the West Texas sky was doing what it did at dusk, burning through its colors from gold to copper to deep blue, the stars gathering at the edges of the dark the way they always did. Kate sat down at her place and looked at the faces of the people at her table, and she thought, clearly and with the complete honesty that was the most fundamental thing about her, that this was the life she had written about in the 13th letter. Not as she had imagined it, because she had not allowed herself to imagine it too specifically, knowing by then the cost of specific hope, but as she had meant it when she wrote about the stars and the land and wanting something built on something real. Real was exactly what it was. She picked up her fork. Cecil caught her eye and held it for a moment with the steady, knowing look, and she held it back. Thomas said something about a fence post. Clara said something about a book. William said no to the carrots with great conviction. The evening settled around them, warm and particular and exactly right. Kate Covington had written 13 letters, and 12 of them had met silence, and one of them had changed everything, not because it was a miracle, not because fate had intervened in some dramatic fashion, but because she had been honest and stubborn and willing to try one more time, and the man who answered had been honest back, and together they had built a life that was in every sense the thing she had been looking for and more than she had known to ask for, and it was good, and it was real, and it was theirs.